Amen. You may be seated even in the presence of the Lord. And all that is going on, it is good for us to be here. And we are grateful for the opportunity to share and reflect even in this time. In addition to the opportunity to reconnect with an old friend in Mike, for which I thank you all saints for making possible. We've also been able to connect and see faces of other friends, Jasmine, Judy, David, Raina. And we're grateful for all that you have created and the opportunity for us to share, including a little excursion for my family before school starts again. As we have experienced that which may be in our minds and in our hearts in the last 24 hours, I'd like to add to the 107th Psalm that has been read as sacred text and the 12th chapter of Luke, which has been read in our hearing. Reading from the tradition that I consider sacred as well, the words of Howard Thurman, Christian mystic and theologian, produced and marginalized by the Black church. So read his words. The individual is interested in relieving human need because he sees it as, in some definite sense, crowding out of the life of others the possibility of developing those qualities of interior graces that will bring him to immediate candidacy for the vision of God. It is in this latter sense that we come upon the mandatory raison d'etre of the affirmation mystic's interest in social change and social action. She is not interested in social action because of any particular political or economic theory. She is not interested in social action primarily from the point of view of humanitarianism or humanism, as important as these emphases are. But he is interested in social action because society, as he knows it to be, ensnares the human spirit in a maze of particulars so that the one cannot be cinched nor the good realized. He is not deluded into thinking that once humanity is freed from carking care, from anxiety due to poverty or riches, from misery due to greed and exploitation, they will automatically be an immediate candidacy for the perfectionism of the spirit. She sees, however, that with these situations relieved, there is available a psychological climate in which humanity may ascend the mount of freedom, mount of vision with freedom and abandonment. So ends the reading. I'd like to reflect on where freedom forms. Her face was out of place. On Monday after work, I decided to stop by the Snooks grocery store near the Deaconess Foundation offices to pick up a few items to keep me out of the fast food restaurants and committed to the better diet that my wife wishes for me. As I walked across the parking lot from my car, I heard a familiar call which had become less frequent in recent months. "Pastor?" A thin woman standing actually to the left of the automatic doors queried before I could make it to the sidewalk. "Is that you? You're not over at the church anymore?" By the time I got to the door, I recognized Tiara for the times we had spent together during my pastorate at St. John's Church, the beloved community. She was one of the neighbors, my congregation outside the congregation, whom I had spent much time in conversation and counseling with many times over my 10-year sojourn there. Now 8 months removed from service in that place, I probably hadn't seen her for more than a year. At first glance, it seemed she may still have been wrestling with the particular threats we worked together to ward off in her life: being unhoused, economic distress which fueled sex work, and self-medication with alcohol and drugs. A closer look during the course of our conversation confirmed and gave further evidence. Her skin burned from days like this, outside all day in 90-plus degree heat with the sun beating down, disheveled hair and clothing from swift preparation for the day without the benefit of a looking glass, more missing teeth than our last conversation, reflecting extended lack of access to oral care and the impacts of protracted drug use. What I figured from my gaze conversation confirmed. Tiara shared that in the next few days, as a matter of fact, just this past Thursday, she would undergo surgery to amputate her left leg. Sleeping outside, she was bitten by a poisonous brown recluse spider. Without knowing what was going on, and as one of the 27 million people in America without health care coverage, she went 2 months with a growing, gaping wound in her leg. When the pain, the excretions, and the opening in her flesh became too much to bear, she went to the emergency room. There, just weeks before our chance encounter, she received the diagnosis and the treatment plan. Pray for me, Pastor. It took me a while to decide, but I said I had to go on and do it and leave it to God. The doctor said she knew it was a hard thing, a lot to think about, but I'm going to go on because this leg right here is just dead. So I prayed. Mid-conversation in my mind and then out loud with her. And every day this week, until Thursday, as we were preparing to come here, and it hit me really hard. After I talked with God and with one another, I headed into the grocery store. As I went through the doors, and a final word about what she was juggling, she told me, I might need some bus fare when you come out. As I pushed my cart through the store, the particulars of Tiara's situation overwhelmed me. I remembered how tough it was for her returning to the neighborhood and family from detention or attempted escape, couch surfing in other communities. In various cycles during my time at the church, I recall the earnest desire for more and better. I couldn't imagine things having gotten much worse than they were the last time I saw her, but of course with the pending surgery, they did. In the midst, though, of all of this, she trusted and wanted to connect with God, first in her decision-making, then in her request for intercession. I wondered how much her appeal for me to pray had to do with an understanding of my office and role in her life as pastor, or was there some calculation that she lacked the divine access to some evasive capacity necessary to settle her heart and steady the hand of the doctor to make sure the surgery will go well? Either way, there was something wrapped up in the request and the challenge of her life circumstance that called me again to pastoral duty and a greater sense of purpose. Our encounter in that place seemed to matter. Place. El Paso. Dayton. Sandy Hook. Columbine, Ferguson. Places. Places that have come to signify something different, something more than the geography or the population of the people there gathered, something more than the culture of those who come together, a signification of the maze of particulars that we wrestle with in our time and in our community. El Paso somehow for us means more today about white terrorism, white supremacy, and white nationalism than it does about the border status, the bicultural nature of this thriving community, largely of brown people whose senses and smells and tastes take me back to the Tex-Mex realities of my Dallas, Texas roots. But today, El Paso signifies something deeply wrong with America more than it signifies the reality of the people. It tells us about our particulars. Ferguson. My dear sister, a brilliant artist and organizer by the name of Dee Nichols, is wrestling this week on Twitter with people who who articulate that we are somehow now 5 years after Ferguson. Ferguson, a city that still exists. 5 years after Ferguson, wrestling with issues that are wrapped up in what that term signifies. The place is only a sign for the maze of particulars of supremacy, of challenge, of racial inequity that we have come to know. near that place, Ferguson, in St. Louis County, just 6 years after Eden Theological Seminary had admitted its first black student, Howard Washington Thurman visited St. Louis for its spring convocation. Over the course of 4 days in mid-February of 1939, he delivered a series of 4 lectures that has been acknowledged as, quote, Thurman at his most scholarly. Under the series header, Mysticism and Social Change, he developed an interpretation of mystic practice, considered its symbolism, and examined its relationship to ethics. In the culminating lecture on February 16, Thurman addresses those Rufus Jones termed affirmation mystics, defined as those who are concerned with working out in a social frame of reference the realism of their mystic experience. Therein, he explored grounding reasons for mystics' action to bring down manifestations of evil in systems of oppression, creating difficulties in the lives of others in community. Taken together, the mystic theologian framed a spirituality which may have been equally valuable for the German abolitionist ancestors of those gathered in the chapel those days. At the time, as helpful for those of us shaped by the school's social justice commitments years later to lead congregations in communities established by those same ancestors. St. John's Church is one such congregation. Founded in 1852, 1 year before the seminary, and boasting at least one leader who had led a long pastorate at the congregation, then went on to serve as the president of the seminary. Fairground Park, where St. John's is one of those neighborhoods. First populated by German immigrants and later abandoned in common patterns of white flight. Now the area, more than 90% African American and largely impoverished, is the closest thing Tiara has to a home. Evidently, I'm still her pastor. A pastor whose preparation included a unique classroom experience at Eden Seminary. In the spring semester of 2007, Dr. Enoch Oglesby, an African-American professor of Christian ethics, for 3 decades at the seminary, taught his first and only class comprised of all African-American students. It's also the only class I ever had in 8 combined years of theological education where all my classmates were black. There were 8 of us. Over that term, we delved deeply into the spirituality and theology of Howard Thurman. We did come to explore the thinker as mystic and prophet, centering scholarship from a former Eden professor, Dr. Luther Smith. In that classroom, so small that it is now an administrative office, our practices and embedded theologies were stretched by the poetry and biography of this guiding soul. We came to know Thurman as more than a mentor to civil rights leaders or the author of Jesus and the Disinherited. Within that unique, close-knit community of black seminarians sitting at the feet of an elder, learning of the witness of an ancestor, God prepared me for a space and place of formation. Central to that formation was breaking down the silos of false Western binary thinking about spiritual purpose in the world. One thing the German evangelical community gathered to hear Thurman in 1939 in my little classroom of black ministers in the making in 2007 had the tendency and commonality to do is to allow the emergence of a false dichotomy between progressive commitments to social transformation and evangelical calls for personal piety. Indeed, these poles still pull at the corners of Protestant mainline denominations like the United Church of Christ, to which Eden is affiliated, and the historic black church traditions like the Baptist and Pentecostal fellowships represented in our class. And I bet they're not that far from Episcopalians either. I recognize the limitations, yet make sense of the commonalities between notions of piety present in German evangelical heritage, personal conservatism in the black church, and mystical asceticism analyzed by Thurman. But it also has been the case in places, institutions, and among individuals rooted in progressive religious moments that macro-level social change has become an end unto itself. the only purpose for service, while evangelicals, like the ones who raised me in church, define mission as the conversion of individuals, while like Martin Luther King Jr., those with a social gospel ethic see the redemption of the soul as primary for the work of social transformation. King, a student of Thurman, engaged in strategies and tactics of nonviolent direct action, which sought to win the oppressor as a step in the process of changing systems. Religious thought further to the left, the concept of individual lifestyle change and engagement with spiritual disciplines in the interest of divine connection is de-emphasized altogether. Herein, it becomes difficult to discern faith-inspired action from progressive secularism simply wrapped in religious garb and thought. To each of us who come into contact with tiaras, wrestling with the particulars of life and yearning for connection to something greater, Thurman offers a gift. No matter where we or our spiritual traditions fall on this spectrum, his articulation of the purpose for mystical engagement and social action has value and renders a loving critique. Not for any political or economic theory, not for humanism or humanitarianism, but rather because society as we know it to be ensnares the human spirit in a maze of particulars so that the one cannot be sensed nor the good realized. Thurman rejects the polarization of spiritual discipline and social action, while also refusing to leverage individual conversion simply as a tool for societal change. Consistent with his mystic commitments, rather, Thurman suggests the ability to achieve and cultivate God consciousness is the primary act of in the human project. Rather than seeking to change the individual in order to change society, he makes the case that those truly interested in meeting human need must work to remove the network of oppressive nuisances which inhibit psychic, mental, and spiritual abilities to see and hear God's Spirit speak. Liberating people from this maze of particulars is the most important alignment of asceticism and action as it leverages social transformation to allow for lives connected to God. And I got to tell you, as I listen to these readings today about place and liberation on the journey for the psalmist and creating place to put all our stuff, the gospel reader and our greed, I am reminded of some words of my grandfather, who I spent most of my senior year with in high school because he had lost my grandmother and I had lost my brother to community violence. And we kind of hung out together, most times both miserable. One of the things he told me, he said, boy, there ain't but three things in life you got to do. Find your place, get in your place, and stay in your place. As you may sense, he wasn't very happy with me at the time. He had more to do with a child's place, you know what I'm saying? But as a war veteran, as a son of the segregated South, he understood settling in situation in place as a protective factor for the preservation of life and dignity. While I grew up in different circumstances, the more I think back over my life, the more I appreciate his words. For me, place has been formative and significant in shaping my calls to ministries for justice. So I wonder, why did Howard Thurman construct this set of lectures to deliver at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis County and never speak of them or publish them again? How much was my own pastoral trajectory changed by the conversations in that little classroom of black seminarians? What if I had gone to the store that I usually patronize around the corner from my house on Monday and never saw Tiara again? And since I came to know of St. John's through my studies at Eton, would I have ever found my way to that congregation and thus to Tiara if I had not passed by that way before? One of the enduring images I have of Howard Thurman for me is him as a young boy in Florida lying in the grass or propped up against what he talked about as the trees, gazing up into the sky. It was in those moments he noted that he began to sense and explore the unity of all creation in nature. He came to those moments. Perhaps it was there where he initiated cultivation of the sensibilities that others would come to identify as mystical. But he only got there because when he was a 7-year-old boy, the pastor of his family church refused to funeralize his father because his worship patterns were as consistent as those of my grandfather, which means very inconsistent. And when he could not find sanctuary for his family in the church, Thurman found sanctuary underneath the stars at night with the sounds of the ocean on Florida's coastline. God invited him to new places. It was in those places that he connected with the one. Place matters. So why would Thurman speak these words in St. Louis? I believe in 1939, God, through Howard Thurman, spoke 75 years into the future of St. Louis. By virtue of doing so, he carried a message now 80 years into the future for America. On August 9, 2014, when a black teenager named Michael Brown Jr. was killed by police officer Darren Wilson, we would need the lessons of his lectures on mysticism and social change more in St. Louis County than anyone else in the world. The shooting and the dehumanizing nature of this teenager being left lying in his own blood for more than 4 hours on the street in St. Louis County fueled the youth-led Ferguson uprising, which captured the imagination of the world. This movement called systems to task, clergy to action, and gave energy to a budding movement for Black lives. Through the commission, the Ferguson Commission, which I was called to lead, the region paused to pay attention to the maze of particulars. From a discriminatory criminal justice practice to inequitable educational opportunities which make young black and brown people less likely to realize the good which Thurman alludes to. All of this would occur in the county where Thurman spoke these words first and hardly ever again. Key moments for this uprising would need prepared places to emerge. Hear me, placemaking is an act of God to facilitate connection between humanity and the divine. These places can be naturally occurring, as evidenced by Howard Thurman's young life, or carved out of the natural environment or social order through construction and intention. Curating places beyond the maze of particulars which ensnare the human spirit is an act of resistance which liberates people to experience God. In Thurman's words, this makes available a psychological climate in which people may ascend the Mount of Vision with freedom and abandonment. In his 2018 book, Palaces for the People, Dr. Eric Kleinenberg, professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, explores what he calls social infrastructure and how it helps heal social divisions and make communities more resilient. He defines the term as physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact, noting that when social infrastructure is robust, it fosters contact, mutual support, and collaboration among friends and neighbors. From comparisons to how Chicago neighborhoods fared through a 1995 heat wave, to the ways the Small Schools Initiative of the 2000s and reducing campus size, increased student graduation rates, likelihood to enroll in college, and matriculation at elite universities, the sociologist effectively argues that place and freedom from some of our most intractable challenges are connected. Deliberative design can be a valuable input to removing the isolation which leaves someone like Tiara alone to wrestle with life's challenges. It can also create space for community building to facilitate response to flashpoints like police-involved shooting, mass murders due to white terrorism, community violence, and political conflict. And sometimes all those things are feeding one another from the White House. These places in community also demonstrate what Walter Brueggemann called in prophetic imagination an alternative witness to the separation and oppression in wider society. I met Jasmine at an early activation for me in the Ferguson uprising When St. John's, the place I first met Tiara, opened its doors to the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride to Ferguson in August of 2014 as a welcome center for Ferguson October and fall of that year. Over the next 4 years, we would keep doing this with different groups, but through this ministry of placemaking, even with the access restrictions imposed by a 90-year-old building, the church gained clarity about its own purpose. Christian Blackman, a justice-loving community organizer and one of the leaders of the church who identifies as a black queer woman, once remarked that in the folks who came on the Freedom Ride, she saw herself and found her folks. Those folks approximated Thurman's position as a boy because many, because of their lack of access to resources, sexual orientation, or gendered identity, had also been pushed out or marginalized by the church. Our work to make them feel welcome was appreciated by some and understandably greeted with suspicion by others. While their ministries of presence were critical for our own self-understanding and their witness of support was a gift to us, when they returned to their communities, they would find some of the same ostracization and marginalization that they left. Our hospitality in that moment would mean a critical escape from particular oppressions for freedom riders. At St. John's during the ride, valuable connections for resilience and resistance were made as the place had been prepared. I learned later by reading her book, When They Call You a Terrorist, that while they knew of one another and had communicated over the phone, Black Lives Matter co-creator Patrice Con-Colors, our friend from SoCal, first met her co-founder Opal Tometi in person on the first night of the Freedom Ride at the church. How might our mission and movement for Black lives be different if not for their embrace in that place? Through these times, reflection upon them and connection to new friends I've met in these places, God has helped me to appreciate my own calling to the ministry of placemaking. Placemaking for resistance deepened my sense of purpose. The uprising pushed me to exploit the privileges I had acquired as a straight, male, middle-class clergy person with access to property and social capital with some insulation from the network of societal oppressions. These all needed to be put on purpose through St. John's and the Ferguson Commission to curate social infrastructure to resist the powers that rushed in to hurt and harm Tiara. To help people understand and respond to the maze of particulars that Thurman articulated were crowding out the possibility of developing those qualities of interior graces that would bring her and bring Mike to immediate candidacy for the vision of God. Beyond participating in processes to make people feel better, move on, and relieve the tensions of the moment, this had to inform my understanding and reason for social action through the Ferguson uprising. Finally, for Thurman, the life of the mystic has promise beyond his or her own peace. For affirmation mystics, this promise is manifest in social change which impacts the lives of others. In the language of my Southern home church, this promise will be Tiara's salvation from the maze of particulars which ensnared her spirit, restrained her flourishing. But it doesn't end there. Mystic's activity may also be intended to, in the Pentecostal language, to deliver her, to ascend the mount of vision with freedom and abandonment. In these few words, a mount of vision, Thurman points to a place of aspiration, inspiration, and elevated space of hope where God's future and purpose are revealed. The phrase transports me to a big mound of red dirt in Alabama. Red dirt with concrete protruding out, took up a whole city block. And there, as we went up the top of that mound of red dirt with bulldozers and caterpillars around, Brian Stevenson told a small group of faith leaders in December of 2015 that that mound of dirt would be a memorial to the more than 4,000 people lynched in America. If that wasn't enough, he then took us to what looked like a garage, a loading dock on the backside of his office, and said there, that place, which at one point processed enslaved Africans, there would be the space of a museum that would make the narrative case of the connection in America's evolution from slavery to mass incarceration. Both were empty campuses to us, and preachers who think they see visions really didn't see it. We saw red dirt. May of 2018, not 3 full years later, I returned to Alabama on a pilgrimage with the Children's Defense Fund and Jack and Jill of America with my family to honor the 55th anniversary of the Children's Crusades. Before leaving, we drove from Birmingham to Montgomery. First, we visited that old loading dock at one time processing enslaved Africans and learned together in the Legacy Museum, which opened just a few weeks before. I was moved that at its conclusion, if you follow the appropriate ambulation around the museum, at the very end, before you leave, there is a video and a wax statue created, as you see on the video, from gunshots going through the wax, leaving the form that is there entitled "For Mike" and dedicated to the memory of Michael Brown, Jr. Then we traveled over to where that mound of dirt was transformed to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And in this sacred space, my 3 boys read the columns engraved with the names of the lost, hanging, suspended in the air, and at times over their young heads. While difficult for some to experience, for Stevenson, the 2-part project is an effort to help people see clearly the impact of history and move into God's calling for healing. In this way, Brian Stevenson is a prophetic placemaker who carved a mount of vision for all of us. At the memorial, a place of solemnity and reflection, I hear God speaking directly to me and through the ancestors who are memorialized there. Of course, memorials aren't the only place. You can turn around the corner in Tennessee and go to Alex Haley Farm, where Marion Wright Edelman is creating retreat space for us to ascend the Mount of Vision. 45 minutes away, you can see where Ashley Henderson and Alan Steele are holding up the Highlander School and its history and legacy. And you will see in their story that making place and space for people to see God's vision is dangerous work. Highlander was not just firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan in 1966. It was also the victim of arson in April of 2019. While, of course, the Mount of Vision is more than a physical place, it's also more than a metaphor. Because Thurman is speaking in the context of social change and social action, and affirmation mystics are concerned with working out in a social frame of reference, real talk, real stuff about their mystic experience. We must consider how this mount can be physically and socially manifest in our communities. One of the things Dr. Oglesby taught me was that the kingdom of God is already and not yet. In the experience of encountering Jesus, though, his followers got a sense that they experienced the kingdom. The same may be true with the Mount of Vision. It may well be that these physical places are not the Mount of Vision. Indeed, they may be a network of places and spaces where we get glimpses of God's vision and see clearly for just a few moments. The Mount of Vision is the place where freedom is formed as people escape the maze of particulars and connect with the power of the one. Thurman's lectures on mysticism and social change, Dr. O's class on Thurman's spirituality and theology. St. Louis is wrestling with the realities of the Ferguson uprising, Black Lives Matter's Freedom Ride to Ferguson, America facing the legacy of slavery and incarceration, civil rights leaders training to change the world, child advocates connecting to chase child well-being. My ministry to Tiara, Tiara's talk with God. Each encounter needed a place to experience God's purpose and move beyond these ridiculous particulars. May this be such a place. God bless you.